April 24th, 1980, a clear afternoon in Slave Lake, a quiet town in northern Alberta. A 3-year-old boy pedals his red tricycle across the yard while his mother folds laundry by the window. 20 minutes later, the tricycle lies on its side, the street is empty, and the child is gone. No cry for help, no sound of struggle, only silence thick enough to erase a name. How does someone vanish in broad daylight, in a place where every neighbor swore they saw everything? Slave Lake, Alberta, in the spring of 1980 was the kind of place people described as safe by nature. A cluster of neat houses surrounded by long stretches of forest and the scent of pine. Families left their doors unlocked. Children rode their tricycles down the dirt roads, and neighbors greeted one another by name. In that quiet rhythm of small-town life, people believed that danger was something that happened elsewhere, far beyond the edges of their map. On the morning of April 24th, the air was cool but bright. Denise McKee, 32 years old, was hanging laundry in the small yard behind her home. Her son, Jeffrey Dupre, was 3 years old, a talkative, curious child with chestnut-brown hair that caught the sun and a small scar on his chin from a tumble the year before. He had a favorite toy, a red tricycle still shiny from Christmas. He was proud of it, and liked to race his friend Rodney, who lived next door. That day, around 1 o'clock, Jeffrey asked his mother if he could go see Rodney. Denise said yes. She had a load of washing to move from the washer to the dryer and could see the boys from the kitchen window. The distance between their homes was less than 50 meters, no more than the length of a short street. She could hear their voices as she worked, the sound of the tricycles, the small bursts of laughter that belong only to children who still believe the world is safe. A few minutes later, she heard Rodney's father calling for his son to come inside. Denise glanced out of the window and saw neither boy. Assuming Jeffrey had followed his friend into the house, she carried on with the laundry. 20 minutes passed. Then came a knock at the door. It was Rodney, standing alone. He looked confused and asked, "Can Jeffrey come out to play?" In that instant, Denise's stomach turned cold. She rushed outside, calling her son's name, searching the small patch of grass, the edges of the road, behind the neighbor's shed. The red tricycle lay on its side near the curb, one wheel slowly spinning. There were no footprints leading away, no sound of crying, nothing that made sense. At 1:45 p.m., she called the police. The officer on the line told her they were short-staffed and suggested she check the neighborhood with friends before they sent a car. She did as told, knocking on doors, shouting Jeffrey's name, running from yard to yard until her voice broke. When she called again an hour later, she was no longer calm. By the time the first officers arrived, nearly 2 hours had passed since the boy had last been seen. They searched the immediate area first, the ditches, the alley behind the houses, the nearby woods. Denise described her son's clothes: a blue t-shirt, red shorts, and a pair of plastic sandals with cartoon faces on the straps. The officers noted the description and wrote the words "possible abduction" in their report, though at that stage it was only a line on paper, not yet an official theory. By late afternoon, the story had already spread across town. Volunteers began to gather, men left their shops and workplaces, teachers brought students to join the search. The local fire chief organized groups to comb the area in grids. They walked shoulder to shoulder across the open fields, calling Jeffrey's name into the wind. The search went on through the night, flashlights slicing through the trees, the air heavy with smoke from the forest fires burning miles away. At dawn, more volunteers arrived. 200 people, maybe more. Every home, every shed, every ditch was checked again. Nothing. When the search ended that first night, Denise refused to go home. She sat in a neighbor's kitchen, staring at the door, waiting for a sound that never came. Her husband, Ray, had returned from a business trip in High Prairie as soon as he heard the news. He stayed out with the searchers until his legs gave out. At 3 a.m., he lay down for an hour, then went back out again. Neither of them spoke much. There was nothing left to say that could fit the scale of what had just happened. In the early hours of April 25th, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police officially classified the case as a missing person report, but the investigators quickly realized that this was not a case of a child wandering off. There was no trail, no item dropped, no sign of an accident. The pattern was too abrupt, too clean. Something, or someone, had taken Jeffrey away from the familiar world in the span of a single minute. That morning, the first hint of what might have happened came from a woman who lived 3 houses down. She said she had seen a small pickup truck parked near the street around the time Jeffrey vanished. Inside were a man and a woman. The man, she recalled, was in his 30s, fair hair, clean-shaven. The woman was younger, perhaps in her mid-20s, with shoulder-length brown hair. They looked ordinary, nothing remarkable. She thought she saw the woman lean out of the passenger window and call to the child, but she couldn't hear the words. The next second, the truck was gone. When officers asked for more detail, the woman hesitated. She wasn't sure about the color of the vehicle, maybe light blue, maybe gray. It had shiny chrome bumpers and a short box at the back, possibly a GMC or Chevrolet from the late 70s. She couldn't recall the license plate. She had assumed it was just a neighbor's visitor. That witness statement would later become the backbone of the investigation, the only solid lead in a case that would outlive decades. But at that moment, on that spring afternoon, it was one clue among many fragments. A mother's scream, a fallen tricycle, a town that would never again believe itself untouched by danger. By nightfall, Slave Lake had changed. The same houses stood, the same pine trees whispered in the wind, but the sense of safety was gone. Windows that had been left open were closed. Parents kept their children close. The red tricycle was taken inside, cleaned, and placed in a corner of the living room. Denise kept looking at it, not as a memory, but as evidence, the last trace of her son's presence in a world that suddenly felt too wide, too silent. And from that day on, no one ever saw Jeffrey Dupre again. When the sun rose over Slave Lake on April 25, 1980, the search for Jeffrey Dupre entered its second day. The town's main street was unusually quiet. Local shops remained closed, and the only traffic moving was a convoy of police vehicles and volunteer trucks carrying supplies. Word of the missing child had already reached the provincial offices of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who sent additional officers and a helicopter to assist. The headquarters of the operation was set up in the town's recreation hall. Inside, long folding tables were covered with maps, thermos flasks, and hand-drawn sketches of the area. Denise and Ray Dupre sat at one end, surrounded by friends and neighbors who tried to keep them calm. Denise had barely slept. She still believed that someone, somewhere, would call to say they had found her son wandering by the road, tired but unharmed. That belief would not survive the day. By mid-morning, the RCMP began to treat the disappearance as a likely abduction. The lead investigator, Sergeant Alan Creighton, a man with 20 years of field experience, studied the first witness statement closely. The description of the truck and the couple inside suggested a deliberate act rather than chance. It was a rare type of crime for a small Canadian town. A child taken in daylight, within sight of home, without a single sound of struggle. Search teams were reorganized. The woods north of the Dupre home were combed again, this time with police dogs. Air support scanned the lakeshore and nearby roads. Officers stopped every vehicle leaving town, checking for children matching Jeffrey's description. None did. By the afternoon, more than 300 people had joined the search. Students from the local high school walked the perimeter of the community in rows, shoulder to shoulder, calling Jeffrey's name. The town's radio station broadcast updates every hour, asking listeners to check their sheds, garages, and backyards. Each hour that passed made it harder to believe Jeffrey had simply wandered off. That evening, as temperatures dropped, the command center received the official transcript of the witness interview. The details were limited but consistent. A small, late 70s pickup, possibly custom painted, occupied by 2 people, 1 male, 1 female. The woman had been seen bending towards the child, perhaps calling him over. Then the truck drove away fast, tires spinning on gravel. Sergeant Creighton marked the statement with a red pen. It was the first piece of information that suggested the disappearance was not an accident. But a good lead is not the same as evidence. Without a license plate or second witness, the description could fit hundreds of vehicles across the province. On the 3rd day, the search widened to the surrounding highways. Officers checked rest stops, motels, and campgrounds. Truck drivers were questioned about anything unusual they might have seen. A few remembered seeing a light-colored pickup heading south that afternoon, but no one could say for sure who was inside. By the 4th day, the story reached the national news. Television crews arrived, filming outside the small police station. Reporters called it the Slave Lake Mystery. They showed the photograph of Jeffrey sitting on his red tricycle, smiling, his eyes bright. The image became the face of the investigation, printed on posters across Alberta. For the Dupré family, the attention brought both help and suspicion. Denise noticed the tone of the questions reporters asked. "When was the last time you saw him alive?" one asked bluntly. "Do you think he might have run away?" another asked, as if a 3-year-old could plan such a thing. She realized that even in tragedy, a mother's actions are often measured against impossible standards. In the following week, officers interviewed every neighbor on the street. Most said the same. It was a quiet afternoon. They had seen nothing strange. One elderly man mentioned hearing a vehicle accelerate suddenly, but he could not recall the direction. Another resident thought she saw a woman standing near the road earlier that morning, but she dismissed it at the time as a passerby. On the 10th day, when no new evidence appeared, a different kind of theory began to form, one that turned inward. Some investigators, under pressure from their supervisors, considered the possibility that Jeffrey's disappearance might have been a domestic matter. Such suspicions were not uncommon in child cases where leads ran dry. They interviewed Denise and Ray separately, checking their stories for inconsistencies. Denise answered every question calmly, until they mentioned the possibility that she herself might be involved. The words froze her. She told them she had nothing to hide, and if they thought otherwise, they should test her. Within hours, she was taken to Edmonton to undergo a polygraph examination. The test lasted several hours. When it ended, the examiner told the investigators there was no sign of deception. But damage, once done, is hard to undo. For months afterward, Denise would sense a change in the way some officers looked at her, not as a grieving mother, but as someone whose innocence had to be proven again and again. Meanwhile, Sergeant Creighton continued to collect information. He requested lists of all vehicles matching the witness description registered within a 200-kilometer radius. He also contacted U.S. Border Patrols to watch for any child fitting Jeffrey's appearance. The response was routine. No matches, no sightings. By early May, the official search was scaled down. Volunteers returned to their jobs, students to their classes. The Dupré family home became a kind of quiet landmark, the house where the boy had disappeared. A few sympathetic neighbors brought meals, but conversation had changed. Some avoided eye contact, unsure what to say. For Denise, days blended into nights. She kept the curtains open, hoping to see headlights stop outside. Sometimes in the half-light of dawn, she thought she heard the small rattle of tricycle wheels. It was always the wind. When the RCMP issued its first formal statement 3 weeks after the disappearance, it was brief. The investigation into the missing child, Jeffrey Dupre, age 3, remains open. All leads are being pursued. There was no mention of abduction, no suspects named. To outsiders, it sounded professional. To Denise, it sounded like silence. The case file began to grow thicker. Statements, maps, aerial photographs, lists of vehicles. Each document represented an hour of effort and a lifetime of waiting. The officers who had been there from the beginning started to rotate out, assigned to new cases. A new detective would arrive, read the file, and shake his head at how little there was to go on. Within a few months, Slave Lake returned to its routines. The school reopened, the fires were put out, and people stopped mentioning Jeffrey's name in public. But in the police archives, one thin folder remained on the shelf, labeled with a single word: missing. And beneath that word lay a question that no one in Slave Lake could yet answer. How does a child vanish from a street filled with eyes and leave behind not a trace? By the summer of 1981, Slave Lake had gone back to the rhythm of ordinary life. The search posters, once pinned on every pole and window, had faded under the weather. Only a few remained, their edges curled, colors washed to pale pinks and grays. People still remembered the boy, but memory, like the lake itself, had grown still. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police kept the case open on paper, yet activity slowed to a crawl. There were no new witnesses, no new leads. Every few months, an officer would revisit the Dupre home to check in, more out of procedure than hope. Files were updated with the words, "No significant development." For Denise McKee, each visit was a quiet reminder that her son's name existed now only in reports and newspaper archives. Ray Dupre returned to work in High Prairie. The house that had once been filled with a child's laughter became a place of muted sounds. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of floorboards when Denise moved through the rooms at night. She kept Jeffrey's small shoes by the front door, dusted and aligned as if waiting for their owner. It was an act not of denial, but of discipline, a way to make the absence manageable. In 1983, a family traveling through British Columbia reported seeing a boy who resembled Jeffrey. The description was close enough that RCMP officers in Vancouver followed up. The child, however, turned out to be the son of a local couple. His resemblance was coincidence. Such false alarms became common, each one reopening wounds that had never healed. By 1985, the national press had turned to other stories. A decade of missing children cases across North America had flooded the public with names and faces. Jeffrey's photo still appeared occasionally in missing persons roundups, but his case, like many others, had gone cold. In 1986, a new investigator named Tom Ridley took over the file. Ridley was methodical, known for treating old cases as puzzles rather than lost causes. He reviewed every statement, every sketch, every map. After weeks of analysis, he told a reporter from the Edmonton Journal that he had a gut feeling Jeffrey might still be alive. It was not evidence, only intuition, yet it was the first spark of belief the case had seen in years. Ridley proposed comparing Jeffrey's file with the newly formed National Missing Children database. The results were inconclusive. There were no matches, no cross-linked incidents that fit. Denise followed the story from home. She clipped the article and folded it neatly into Jeffrey's baby album, the one filled with Polaroids from before 1980. Birthdays, the first haircut, a trip to the lakeshore. The pages smelled faintly of old paper and detergent. She looked at them sometimes to remind herself that her son had been real, a child who existed beyond the word missing. In 1988, the Dupre family moved to Edmonton. Ray's health had begun to fail, his heart weakened by years of travel and stress. The move was meant to bring a new start, but Denise noticed how often he drove back to Slave Lake, parking by the old house without going inside. He said little about it. In 1990, he died suddenly of a heart attack at 50. On his desk, police later found an envelope addressed to RCMP Slave Lake. Inside was a note: "If Jeffrey is alive, please tell him I never stopped looking." That same year, RCMP headquarters decided to archive the Dupre file under inactive cases. It was not closed. In Canada, a missing child file never officially closes, but it was moved off the active rotation. The folder joined hundreds of others in a steel cabinet, its label typed in fading ink. For Denise, time no longer passed in years, but in anniversaries. Each April 24th, she lit a candle, small and white, in the kitchen window. On some nights, she thought she heard her son's voice, a trick of memory shaped by wind through the trees. She had no photographs newer than 1980, no proof of what he might look like as a teenager. In her mind, he remained forever 3, laughing, eyes wide, calling her name across the yard. The 1990s brought a few fleeting rumors. A man in Manitoba claimed to have seen a young adult with Jeffrey's features working at a roadside diner. A caller from the United States sent a letter suggesting a link to a child trafficking ring. None of it led anywhere. Each time, DNA testing or witness verification erased the hope as quickly as it appeared. By the turn of the millennium, technology began to change the landscape of old investigations. DNA databases, digital records, and online archives made it easier to revisit cases long thought unsolvable. Jeffrey's file was scanned into a national system in 2000. A new photograph of his age-progressed face was generated by computer, showing what he might look like at 23. Denise stared at the image on her screen for a long time. The eyes were familiar, the jaw slightly different. She printed it anyway, placing it next to the original photo on her wall. In 2010, when wildfires swept through parts of Slave Lake, Denise feared that the physical files might be destroyed. RCMP assured her that digital copies were safe. She thanked them, but kept a personal binder at home. Every clipping, letter, and note since 1980, a private archive of persistence. She had become, by then, a woman others sought for advice. Families of missing children called her to ask how she kept going. She always gave the same answer: "You keep a door open, even if no one ever walks through it." In 2015, Denise joined social media and created a page titled "What Happened to Jeffrey Dupre?" She uploaded the old photos, the police sketch, and a short description of the day he vanished. The page gathered followers from across Canada, strangers who shared the posts, people who said they had never forgotten the story. For the first time in decades, the case found a second life online. That quiet resurgence brought new messages. Some were kind. Others claimed to have information or psychic visions. Denise read them all, replying only to those that seemed grounded in fact. She had learned to filter hope through reason. Through all those years, one question remained exactly where it began. What became of a boy who rode his tricycle across a yard and was gone before his mother turned her head? The case had become more than a tragedy. It was a measure of how fragile ordinary life could be. Beneath the still surface of small towns and safe neighborhoods, uncertainty always waited, silent, patient, never aging. And in the archives of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, in a folder marked Dupre, Jeffrey, missing, Slave Lake, 1980, the silence continued to grow thicker with each passing year. By the early 2000s, most people in Slave Lake had stopped speaking of the boy by name. A new generation had grown up. one that only knew the story through old headlines or the cautious tone adults used when describing what had once happened on Birchwood Drive. But for Denise McKee, the years had not erased the image of that red tricycle or the memory of a door left half open. She was now in her 50s, living quietly in Edmonton, still keeping the binder of documents beside her bed. The police had not contacted her in a long time, yet she called them every spring, just to make sure Jeffrey's file was still listed as active. The year 2000 brought a small change that felt larger than it was. Canada's national database for missing persons was finally digitized. For the first time, cases like Jeffrey's could be searched by DNA, by physical description, or by regional match. Denise submitted a fresh sample to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, though she understood the odds were long. "If they find someone who doesn't know who he is," she told the clerk, "I want him to have a name." The clerk nodded, not quite knowing what to say. In 2003, there was a brief surge of hope. A Canadian consulate worker in Washington state reported a young man with similar features who had been found living without identification. He was cooperative, but confused about his early life. RCMP officers flew down, collected DNA, and compared it to the sample on file. The result came back negative. For Denise, the disappointment was sharp but brief. She had learned not to build castles on rumors. Through that decade, forensic technology advanced faster than local police budgets. Departments prioritized new crimes. Cold cases rarely received funding. Still, every few years, an officer would review the Dupré file. Notes in the margins showed quiet persistence. "Check with U.S. National Center for Missing and Exploited Children," one wrote in 2007. Another added, "Possible link to Oregon 1980 abduction, negative ID." Nothing led anywhere solid. In 2010, Slave Lake suffered another catastrophe, the Great Fire that consumed much of the town. Entire neighborhoods were flattened, and the recreation hall that once served as search headquarters was destroyed. When Denise saw the news footage, she worried the archives might have burned too. But RCMP confirmed that digital backups existed. It was a small relief, mixed with grief for a place that had already lost so much. The fire also revived local memory. Reporters covering the disaster asked older residents about the history of the town. More than one mentioned the missing boy, the one from 1980. New articles appeared, short but respectful, and included Jeffrey's picture once again. For Denise, seeing that photo in print after 30 years was both comfort and pain. She cut one out and taped it to her kitchen wall. Underneath, she wrote a date in blue ink. Still waiting. By 2015, social media had become the new landscape for missing persons advocacy. Denise, encouraged by a friend's daughter, decided to make a page on Facebook. She named it "What Happened to Jeffrey Dupré." She uploaded the old photographs, scanned the newspaper clippings, and posted a brief account of the day he vanished. The story reached beyond Canada almost overnight. Volunteers from across the country shared it on local forums. Comments poured in, some offering sympathy, others sharing similar experiences, and a few claiming to have seen someone who resembled the age progression images of Jeffrey. One message, sent privately, caught her attention. It was from a woman in Oregon who said she remembered a family from Alberta living next door to her in the early 1980s, with a little boy who didn't seem related to them. The woman recalled the boy's quiet manner and the way he sometimes asked questions about a red bike. Denise forwarded the message to RCMP. Investigators followed up, interviewing the witness and tracing the family's records. The boy in question had died in an accident in 1990. DNA confirmed he was not Jeffrey. It was another dead end, but the process awakened something long dormant, the sense that people still cared enough to look. In 2018, an independent group of volunteers specializing in long-term disappearances contacted Denise. They offered to help analyze the case using geographic profiling, a method of studying crime locations to predict offender behavior. Working with public records and old maps, they determined that the most probable escape route used by the kidnappers would have been Highway 2, heading south toward Edmonton. It was the same conclusion Sergeant Creighton had written in pencil on his 1980 field map. After nearly 40 years, the lines had circled back to the same road. Denise found that detail oddly comforting. "At least the truth hasn't changed," she told a journalist. "It means someone, somewhere, took him on that highway. If we can find where the road ended, maybe we'll find him." By 2020, she had become something of an unofficial advocate for long-term missing cases. She was invited to speak at a national symposium in Calgary. Standing before a room of officers and volunteers, she spoke plainly. A cold case isn't cold. It's just waiting for someone new to touch it. The hall was silent for a moment before the applause came. But it was in 2022, 42 years after the disappearance, that the case truly stirred again. Denise, now 68, decided to take matters into her own hands. She launched a GoFundMe campaign to hire a private investigator and commission a new age progression sketch of Jeffrey. This time not by computer software, but by a forensic artist with decades of experience in reconstructing adult faces from childhood photographs. She set the goal at $20,000. Within weeks, donors from across Canada had met it. The artist she chose was Tim Whiddon, a British forensic specialist known for his precise, lifelike renderings. Working from Jeffrey's early photos and family traits, Whiddon created an image of a man in his mid-40s, steady eyes, short brown hair, a faint scar on the chin, the same mark that once defined a toddler's smile. When Denise saw the completed portrait, she said quietly, "That looks like someone I could meet on the street and recognize." The image was released nationwide in December 2022. Posters were printed with the title, "Missing Since 1980, Help Us Find Jeffrey Dupre, age 45. A tip line was set up, and a $5,000 reward offered for any verified information. Television stations picked up the story during the holiday season. The case, dormant for decades, was alive again. Across Canada, volunteers distributed flyers in malls, libraries, and airports. Online, the new sketch was shared thousands of times. Some viewers commented on the resemblance to acquaintances. Others simply wrote, "We remember." It was not proof, but it was movement. The slow kind of movement that sometimes precedes discovery. Denise told a reporter that winter, "People think I'm holding on to the past. But to me, he's not the past. He's still out there somewhere, in time, waiting for me to catch up." In a country that had grown used to statistics, her persistence reminded others that behind each missing person file was a single story, one that refused to fade quietly into the archives. And as snow fell over Slave Lake once again, the old question returned with the same clarity it had in 1980. Where did the road from Birchwood Drive truly lead? The winter of 2022 brought both clarity and fatigue to Denise McKee. The public's sudden interest in Jeffrey's case meant new interviews, messages, and speculation, all of which she tried to manage with patience. Reporters wanted to film her reactions. Strangers sent letters offering theories or sympathy. She accepted each politely, but reminded them that for her, this was not history. It was still an open wound with no clean edge. The RCMP, noticing the attention, agreed to review the file once more. A new generation of investigators took charge, led by Inspector Hannah Cole, who had been a child herself when Jeffrey disappeared. Cole reopened the archived material, now stored on microfilm, and scanned into digital systems. Her team cross-referenced every report, every license registration, and every interview recorded in 1980. They approached the file not as nostalgia, but as a logistical problem. 2 adults in a pickup truck, 1 small boy, 1 road out of town, and 42 years of silence. One of the first steps was revisiting the original witness statements. The primary witness, the woman who had described the light-colored truck, was located again, now in her 70s. Her memory, though dim, was steady in one detail. The woman she saw leaning from the truck window had spoken softly, as if coaxing a pet, not calling loudly. "It wasn't a shout," the witness said, "more like she was saying, 'Come here, honey.' I thought she must have known him." That sentence reshaped the theory. Investigators began to wonder whether the abductors had been strangers at all, or people Jeffrey might have trusted for those few seconds. The team then looked at vehicle records from 1978 to 1980, focusing on custom-painted Chevrolet and GMC pickups registered within 200 kilometers. Hundreds of entries appeared, but one stood out, a truck registered to a man named Walter Kane, who had lived briefly in Slave Lake before moving east. Kane, then 31, matched the physical description. Short, light-haired, clean-shaven. He had worked seasonal construction jobs and left town suddenly the same summer Jeffrey vanished. Records showed no further activity under his name after 1985. The lead was thin, but tangible. Investigators followed it to Manitoba, where Kane's former employer recalled that he traveled with a woman named Marie, younger than him, with brown hair and a quiet voice. They rented a small house near Brandon for 6 months, then disappeared. No birth certificates, no tax records, no trace. The landlord remembered that they sometimes mentioned their boy, who was quiet and well-behaved. At the time, no one asked questions. The RCMP contacted Manitoba authorities to check old-school enrollment records from the 1980s. There was no boy listed as Dupré or Kane of matching age. But the archives were incomplete, many lost to time. The lead faded into paperwork, but it carried the scent of possibility that Jeffrey had lived, at least for some years, under another name. In February 2023, the independent investigator hired by Denise's fundraising campaign traveled to Manitoba to retrace that line. He interviewed locals, searched property deeds, and spoke with a retired mail carrier who remembered the couple vaguely. "They were quiet," the man said. "The kid was polite. They left one night, no goodbye." The private report noted that if the boy had survived, he might now be living under an entirely different identity, unaware of his origin. The idea gave Denise a fragile kind of hope, not proof of loss, not proof of life, but proof of possibility. Meanwhile, the new forensic portrait continued to circulate online. Among the thousands who saw it, one man from British Columbia wrote to the police saying he recognized the face, not as someone missing, but as a customer who had visited his small mechanic shop years earlier. "The scar under the chin," he wrote, "and the way he smiled, looked just like that picture." Investigators checked the man's records. The customer had paid cash, left no forwarding address, and used the name Jeff K. The shop owner remembered that he drove a gray pickup, older model, possibly late 70s. It was another circle back to the same vehicle that had haunted the file for decades. The RCMP tracked the tip as far as they could. But again, the trail dissolved into absence. No camera footage existed from that year. No receipts survived. Yet the cluster of small coincidences, the truck, the scar, the name, added weight to the theory that Jeffrey could have lived beyond the first day of his disappearance. Inspector Cole remained cautious. In a press statement, she said, "The evidence is circumstantial, but the consistency of these details cannot be ignored. Our objective is not to confirm belief, but to verify facts." It was the tone of a professional aware that hope can mislead as easily as it can sustain. By late 2023, the investigation had reached a kind of suspended motion. Every plausible lead had been pursued, yet none could close the circle. The DNA databases offered no match, though technology was now capable of identifying relatives through genetic genealogy, a method that had solved several cold cases in North America. Plans were underway to apply it to Jeffrey's file, pending approval from his extended family. Denise followed every update with the composure of someone long practiced in endurance. She no longer imagined reunion scenes. She imagined paperwork, signatures, verifications, the slow mechanics of truth. When asked by a reporter what she would say if her son were alive, she paused for a long time before answering. "I'd tell him I understand," she said, "that none of this was his fault, and that he doesn't have to come back, but I hope he knows who he is." In early 2024, a documentary crew from Edmonton visited Slave Lake to film a segment for a national series on unsolved disappearances. They stood near the old neighborhood, now rebuilt, and interviewed residents who still remembered the search. One elderly man pointed down the road and said quietly, "That's where the tricycle was." The camera panned across the pavement, smooth and unmarked after years of repair. Nothing remained of the original scene, yet the air seemed to hold its echo. The episode aired that spring. Afterward, the RCMP tip line received several new calls, most vague, one claiming that a man fitting Jeffrey's adult description was living under another name in Ontario. Investigators followed up, but the lead stalled when the man refused DNA testing. Without consent, the case could not proceed. The renewed search, despite its dead ends, achieved something different. It reminded an entire country that the case was not forgotten. Jeffrey Dupre was no longer just a photograph from 1980. He had become a symbol of persistence in the face of silence. For Denise, that was enough to keep going. "They can't say it's impossible anymore," she told her friend that December. "They can only say it hasn't happened yet." And somewhere in the network of highways that once carried a pickup truck out of Slave Lake, the same question still traveled. Quiet, persistent, older now, but unsatisfied. If Jeffrey Dupre survived that day, does he still remember who he was when the road began? By the beginning of 2024, the case file labeled Dupre, Jeffrey, missing since April 24, 1980, had become one of the longest-running active investigations in Alberta. Inside the archive, nearly half a century of paper and data were layered together. Handwritten notes from the first search, photographs yellowed by time, new digital reports printed from recent tip lines. Each document marked a generation of officers who had tried to fit a complete story into a space that refused to close. Inspector Hannah Cole's team focused on what could still be measured. They requested access to the National Genealogical Database, a system that used voluntary DNA samples from the public to trace genetic relatives. It had been the tool behind several long-cold identifications across North America. To proceed, however, the police needed the family's consent and a specific legal authorization, since Canada's privacy laws treated genetic data as deeply personal. Denise agreed without hesitation. "If the truth exists, I want it to find its way home," she told them. The DNA process took months. Samples from Denise and Jeffrey's surviving relatives were coded and entered into the system. Analysts searched for partial matches, not direct identification, but connections through shared ancestry. The first results were disappointing. Distant relatives in Quebec, an old match in France, none close enough to indicate a living connection. Still, the algorithm continued to scan, comparing new submissions each week. Meanwhile, the RCMP reviewed the circumstantial trail left by the couple known as Walter and Marie Kane. Records confirmed they had crossed provincial borders multiple times during the 1980s, but had never been formally charged with any crime. In 1989, a car registered in Walter's name was impounded in Saskatchewan after a minor collision. No children were listed among the passengers. By the early 1990s, both names disappeared from federal records, replaced by nothing but gaps. No deaths, no taxes, no further licenses. Whether they had changed identities, emigrated, or simply vanished remained unknown. Forensic analysis of old materials continued in parallel. The original photograph of the tire marks near the Dupré home, once considered too faint for comparison, was digitally enhanced using modern imaging techniques. Investigators hoped to match the tread pattern with surviving vehicle models from the late 1970s. The result was only partly useful. It confirmed that the vehicle was likely a Chevrolet short-box pickup, model years 1978-1980, consistent with the earliest witness report. It was confirmation, not revelation, a reminder that the earliest facts of the case had been accurate all along. The inquiry now faced a different kind of challenge. After 44 years, the boundary between evidence and memory had blurred. Witnesses were elderly, their recollections layered with the influence of retelling. A few insisted they still remembered hearing the truck that day, its engine loud against the quiet street. Others admitted they might have confused it with the sounds of the firefighting helicopters that had hovered over the town that same week. The more the past was revisited, the more it reshaped itself. In May 2024, one of the genealogical analysts contacted Inspector Cole with a note marked "Possible Second-Degree Relation." A DNA sample from a man in Ontario, uploaded to a public database, shared several genetic markers with the Dupré line. The match was not exact, but close enough to warrant inquiry. The man, identified as Jeffrey K., age 47, was a construction foreman who had been adopted as a child. When approached by officers, he agreed to speak but appeared bewildered by the attention. His adoptive records listed his birth in 1977 in Manitoba, but no official birth certificate was found. Cole's team requested a voluntary DNA test to clarify the relation. The man hesitated, citing privacy and concern for his family. After legal consultation, he agreed, on condition of confidentiality. The analysis took weeks. When the result arrived, it showed a 93% probability of kinship consistent with being a first cousin once removed, strong, but not conclusive proof that he was the missing child. The investigators informed Denise cautiously. She listened in silence, then said, "That sounds like the edge of something real." Further checks revealed that the man's early life before adoption was poorly documented. Hospital records from Manitoba in the late 1970s were incomplete. Several files had been lost in a fire decades earlier. There was, however, one surviving note in the provincial archive. An unnamed male child admitted to a local clinic in 1981, approximately 3 years old, brought in by a woman identified only as Marie. The child had minor injuries and was released after treatment. No follow-up information existed. The date and age fit. The discovery reopened debate among the investigators. Could the Marie in the hospital record be the same woman seen in Slave Lake? Could Jeffrey have lived under a new identity for a time before being placed for adoption? Or was this another coincidence built on fragile numbers and lost paper? Legally, the threshold for declaring a match required absolute confirmation, either DNA from the missing person himself or direct parental linkage beyond doubt. Without that, the case remained open. Still, the lead marked the first credible connection in decades, enough to shift the file from inactive pending back to active review. When the news reached Denise, she did not interpret it as closure. Sitting by her kitchen window, she told a visiting journalist, "Maybe he's out there, maybe he's not. But at least now when I look out, I know which direction to face." In June, the RCMP held a small press briefing. Inspector Cole spoke briefly, choosing her words with care. "We have developed promising genetic leads. Verification will take time, and we will proceed with respect for all individuals involved. After 44 years, this investigation remains about truth, not blame." Reporters asked if she believed Jeffrey was alive. She paused before replying, "The evidence does not exclude that possibility." For a case long defined by silence, those words were as close to light as procedure would allow. In the months that followed, the RCMP continued quiet negotiations with the man in Ontario. The outcome of the DNA verification has not been made public. Confidentiality agreements prevent disclosure until all parties consent. Whether he is Jeffrey Dupre or merely a distant relative remains a question held in balance between science and consent. For Denise, now nearing 70, the uncertainty has become familiar ground. She keeps the new forensic portrait framed beside the old childhood photo. On quiet evenings, she looks at both, not to compare but to acknowledge the years between them, years that took everything yet left her belief intact. "A name can disappear," she once said, "but the truth has a long memory. If the final proof arrives, it will come not as revelation, but as confirmation. A slow arrival of fact through the corridors of law and genetics. And if it never arrives, the story will still have served its purpose: to show how persistence, even without resolution, can become its own form of justice. For now, the file remains open. The red tricycle, preserved by neighbors and later returned to Denise, rests in a local museum exhibit on unsolved cases. The plaque beneath it reads simply, "Jeffrey Dupre, age 3, missing from Slave Lake, Alberta, April 24, 1980. Investigation ongoing." Some visitors pause to read, others move on. But every few weeks, someone leaves a small toy at the base of the display. A sign, perhaps, that the question first asked 44 years ago still waits for an answer. By the winter of 2025, the investigation into the disappearance of Jeffrey Dupre had entered its 45th year. It was no longer only a police matter. It had become part of Canada's collective memory, a symbol of what time cannot erase. The town of Slave Lake, rebuilt and modernized, bore little resemblance to the quiet settlement of 1980. Yet in its library, at the back of a glass cabinet, the same photograph remained: a 3-year-old boy with a red tricycle and a half smile, eyes bright under the sun. Beneath the picture, a single line read, "Still missing." For Denise McKee, now 70, life had become a steady rhythm of waiting and remembering. She still lived in her small house near Edmonton, surrounded by letters from strangers who had followed the case online. Many addressed her as Mama Denise, though they had never met. Each spring, she answered as many as she could, thanking people for keeping her son's name alive. She said the letters reminded her that the search had never truly been hers alone. Her world had narrowed in scale, but deepened in meaning. She spent mornings tending to a small garden behind the house, afternoons volunteering for an organization that helps families of missing persons. Sometimes, young parents approached her for advice, worried about their own children in a world that felt less safe than before. She always said the same thing: "Be careful, but don't live in fear. Fear takes more than loss ever will." The RCMP's Cold Case Unit continues to monitor the genetic lead in Ontario. Officially, the investigation remains open. Unofficially, many officers involved believe that some measure of truth has already surfaced, that Jeffrey lived, at least for a time, under another name. Whether the man now in his late 40s will ever choose to confirm that identity is uncertain, and the law protects his right to privacy. Inspector Hannah Cole, now nearing retirement, says the file has changed the way her team approaches every missing child case. "You don't assume time closes a story," she explained. "It only changes the way you read it." Once a year, on April 24th, the town of Slave Lake holds a small remembrance walk along Birchwood Drive. Children from the local school carry candles. Parents stand quietly beside them. Denise attends when her health allows, though she rarely speaks publicly. Last year, she stood near the place where her yard once ended and looked down the street. There is pavement now, not gravel, and new houses line the road. The sound of engines replaced the silence that had once followed her son's disappearance. For a long moment she stood there, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if listening for something carried back by the wind. Before leaving, she placed a small toy tricycle at the base of the memorial tree and whispered, "If you're out there, you've come far enough. Rest." For those who study such cases, the disappearance of Jeffrey Dupre remains an open question. Part forensic puzzle, part moral reminder. It demonstrates how justice can take the shape of persistence rather than punishment, how a mother's endurance can outlast systems, evidence, and certainty. Even without resolution, the case altered procedures, inspired databases, and built networks that have since reunited other families. In that quiet, practical way, Jeffrey's absence changed what Canada expects of its own guardians. Today, when visitors stop by the museum in Slave Lake, they often see the red tricycle first, small, paint faded, but intact. Next to it lies Denise's handwritten note. "I still believe someone will remember." The exhibit is silent except for the faint hum of air conditioning. Yet for those who pause long enough, there is something else, a presence that belongs neither to past nor to closure, but to the steady courage of those who refuse to let time decide the end of their story. And so the case of Jeffrey Dupre remains exactly where it began. A quiet street, a moment of trust, and a single question that endures through every generation that stops to read his name. If this story moved you, take a moment before you leave. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next case we reopen, and share this video if you believe every missing name deserves to be remembered. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from?